We are in the final chapter of Ruth. Today is Ruth, chapter 4. To recap how we got here, to catch us up, we have come to a book written in 450 BC. It is written in the middle of a movement of violent holiness and militant nationalism that is ripping families apart. Moabite wives and Hebrew children are being expelled from the Hebrew community. And this is based upon the law that no Moabite will have any place among God's people forever. Even if you had an ancestor 10 generations ago that was Moabite. As weeping wives and sobbing babies are being forced out of God's people, someone, likely a woman, speaks up. She speaks up in the style of Jesus to tell the love story of Ruth and Boaz. That no matter what the law may say, our author and Boaz have a generous theology. It is a theology that considers that God and his agape love is extended to all, even the Moabites. And in chapter 1, we're first introduced to Naomi, and she flees a famine from Bethlehem with her family. And they find life and love among the Moabites. These people aren't so bad. But the story takes a tragic turn as Naomi loses her husband. And then she loses her 2 sons. But along the course of these events, we're introduced to Ruth, the Moabite. She becomes a widow when her husband, Naomi's son, dies. And this starts her journey. During this journey, she's going to travel in the same shoes as Abraham, while holding on to more faith than Abraham. But as chapter 1 closes, Ruth is largely overlooked. Naomi is the focal point. Naomi is the one that as they come back to Bethlehem, everyone is concerned about. Ruth expresses her dedication and loyalty to Naomi. And we don't see any exuberant response from Naomi. Ruth is largely overlooked in chapter 1. In chapter 2, Ruth goes out to find food for herself and her mother-in-law, Naomi. And she just so happens to end up in the field of Boaz. It's here that she is noticed for the first time in our story. She catches Boaz's eye. Her love, her loyalty, and her work ethic is highlighted in chapter 2. And Boaz prays for her to receive the full rewards of God, under whose wing she has found a place. Boaz begins by blessing Ruth with the blessings of God's people, which in that moment and right then, it is more food than you can eat. There are now leftovers in the house of food. We've been using a decoder as we've been going through this story to see what different things mean. And now there are leftovers in the house of food. It began with no food in the house of food. But the blessings of God have come. And so Boaz heaps the blessings onto Ruth's plate. Boaz makes arrangements to see Ruth in his field every day. He says, Ruth, I'd like you to go nowhere else. I will make arrangements for this to be as easy as possible for you to come to my field so I get to see you all the time. And this brings us halfway through our story. Ruth goes to Boaz's fields to glean over the next months, through the barley harvest and through the wheat harvest. So we came to chapter 3. Harvest season is at a close. And Ruth and Boaz will no longer have a reason to see each other regularly. They won't have an excuse. And so it's time for Ruth to make a move. Naomi helps her to plan an erotic midnight encounter with Boaz. Ruth is going to put everything on the line, risking scandal in order to secure a marriage with Boaz. So she goes and she finds Boaz over where they're taking the grain and they're sifting it from all the junk and they're taking in the harvest. She finds him at the threshing floor where he goes off by himself, and she finds him there. She goes to him at midnight, and in this encounter we find an empowered woman who declares her independence and chooses her destiny. Boaz asks into the darkness to this woman that he wakes up to find that is suddenly there and wasn't there when he laid down. He asks, "Who are you?" And this is when Ruth gets to state her name. And she is the first person in the story to state her name. I am Ruth. She has grown from when she first came, where she catches Boaz's eye and he begins to favor her. And she says, "Who am I to you? I'm a widow. I'm a foreigner." Her self-esteem is in the dumps. But now she has matured into her identity. And this is her chance. This is the first person in the story to state her name, and she gets to state it for herself. I am Ruth. And upon declaring her name, she leaves behind Naomi's advice to let Boaz take the lead in the moment. And instead, she goes straight for it, and she proposes marriage. On top of it, just to close the deal, she layers on some guilt. I know that I already caught your eye. I know there's already sparks flying, so marry me. And besides, you owe it to me because you're a kinsman redeemer. This is what you're supposed to do anyway. The ancient listener to the story would have been shocked into silence at Ruth's bravery and boldness in a patriarchal society. Is Boaz going to take offense at Ruth's boldness? And there's a pause. Ruth just put it all out there on the line. She proposed to Boaz. There's a pause. And then Boaz accepts. He says, "Yes, let's do this." And everyone cheers. Those listening to the story on the edge of their seats, yes, it's going to happen. But as we saw, what's a good story without a twist? And so Boaz says, "I'll do it." There is someone else, though, who has legal priority over me. He has the first right to redeem. So I have to offer him the chance first. Boaz is going to go to talk to this man and find out if he wants to take the role of redeemer. So Ruth, chapter 3, ends with a cliffhanger. Who is Ruth? She has just come to mature into a confident identity who can express who she is and what she wants. She is going to choose her future. But now there's someone else who apparently has legal precedence before Boaz. Boaz is honest about the issue, but he doesn't seem concerned about the hurdle. He says, I will marry you. There is someone else who has the option to marry you, but I'll marry you. He doesn't seem concerned. But it isn't so easy for Ruth. He says, "Ruth, lay down the rest of the night. Rest here." I don't think she got much rest. And so she lays there with Boaz, sleepless, for the rest of the night before heading home. So a sleepless Ruth comes home to probably a sleepless Naomi. Naomi's future also hinges on this. And Naomi asks, "Who are you?" It's the same question Boaz asked. And Naomi says, "Are you still Ruth, the Moabite and widow? Or are you Ruth, the wife of Boaz with a bright future?" And Ruth throws her hands up. I don't know. I don't know. And upon that cliffhanger, we came to chapter 4. The author has skillfully pulled us in, along with their ancient Jewish audience, to cheer for Boaz and his love to a Moabite. But then they have thrown the future. Just when it seems there's going to be a happy ending, they have thrown the future into doubt. So we're back on the edge of our seats, waiting to see what will happen. True to his character, Boaz gets right on resolving the matter. As dawn is about to break, he loads Ruth up with grain to take home to Naomi. And he says, go on home. It wouldn't be proper when the light comes up for people to see you leave here. But take some food home. This food is a symbol of his promised commitment and provision for the future. No sooner has Ruth headed home than Boaz heads over to the city gate. The city gate is like the town square. The city gate is where business of the day would take place. Typically, if you're looking for someone, they're going to pass through the city gate at some point. And all the important men would be there and they would conduct their business. And so Boaz goes to this place, the city gate, where the major affairs of the people are dealt with. He heads to the city gate early in the morning. And just as he gets there and sits down, because he's going to wait for someone, but he doesn't know when this person's going to walk through the gate. He gets there and sits down, but just as he sits down, who's walking through the gate to head to his own field? The next of kin that has priority before Boaz. The story does something interesting here about the next of kin. It doesn't give us a name. This is an important name to oddly leave out. We had the name of Naomi, we have the name of Ruth. You can see the names that we have, and they all mean something. We even have the nape of the neck shown here in a woman who the last thing we'll see from her in the story is the nape of her neck. Everything has meaning, and so it's odd that this name is left out. No name is given. Instead, the author uses a generic Hebrew word that simply means, suddenly, as soon as Boaz sat down, so-and-so was coming through the gate. The Hebrew here can be understood as the equivalent to our English, Joe Schmo. The author simply is using a marker for this person, but it's an anonymous marker. And so here comes the next of kin, so-and-so, through the gate in the morning. No name given. And Boaz says, hey, Joe Schmo, come on over here and sit down with me. Boaz is a respected guy. And Joe Schmo comes over and he sits down. Boaz also calls over 10 of the respected men of town. He calls them over to sit as legal witnesses to the business that's about to take place. Once everyone is sitting, Boaz says, Joe, you may have heard that Naomi is back from Moab. Well, she has this parcel of land that was her late husband's, and it should have been passed down to her sons, but they're no longer alive. And so Naomi has this parcel of land and she has to sell it. I'm calling on you in front of these witnesses to make a choice right now. Will you buy the land in order to keep it in our clan? Will you redeem this land so we don't lose it, so our clan doesn't lose it? Or if you won't, let me know so that I can buy it and make sure that this land stays within our clan. Now, Joe Schmo, he's not a dumb guy. You have a piece of land that is connected to a couple of widows with no heir in sight to ever inherit it. Naomi's too old to have more kids. Ruth is a Moabite. Who in Bethlehem is going to marry a Moabite to continue on with heirs? If Joe buys this property, then there is no legal challenge that'll prevent him from adding this property to his other holdings and expanding his own family's worth for generations to come. It's a smart decision to redeem this land. So of course he'll redeem it. He's excited to redeem it. This is coming into some good money. But he tries to keep the excitement down a little bit to be properly humble. He looks properly saddened by Naomi's plight that is going to benefit him. He puts on his pious face, a serious face, and he tells Boaz, oh, what a sad turn of events for Naomi. I'm humbled and honored to do this. I will do the right thing and I'll redeem the land. And the back of his head, he's already adding up the money. But he says, I'll do the right thing. And Boaz says, great, Joe. I knew you were a stand-up guy. And I knew you would do the right thing. So here's the price of doing the right thing. You get Ruth, the Moabite, along with the land. The price is that you will marry her and you will start a household together with her. But your first son with Ruth will not be considered your own son. Your first son with Ruth will be considered an heir in the name of her late husband, Mahlon. In order to continue the family of Naomi and keep the name of Mahlon alive, you will raise your first son as if he is the legal son, but now orphan of Mahlon. And this son will eventually inherit Naomi's land in Mahlon's name. It is as if you are genetically raising your own son, but legally you're raising an orphan. And this kid will grow up, and when he's old enough, he will take over what should have been his father's inheritance, Mahlon's inheritance. So, Joe Schmo, you get to double down on good deeds. You get to help Naomi now in preventing the land from leaving the clan. And you get to raise a boy in Mahlon's name to perpetuate the name of your relative who is at risk of being lost to history. In the ancient world, this is one of the worst things that could happen. And so you get to double down on your good deeds. You save the land today, and you'll raise what is genetically your son, but is legally Mahlon's orphan. And he will grow up and he will inherit the land in Mahlon's name. You have to marry Ruth the Moabite. That's a price of redemption. Boaz is shrewd here. We've seen that Boaz has no personal problem with Ruth being a Moabite. Boaz's manager tried to point out the day that Ruth caught Boaz's eye, boss, that is the Moabite. And Boaz went Moabite schmoabite. And he went over to go talk to Ruth. But Boaz knows that others do not share his generous theology. They do not share his generous view of God. Others, such as Ezra and Nehemiah. And he's banking on Joe's prejudice to scare him off of the price of redemption. Joe, you'll be marrying what in our eyes is essentially one of the worst of sinners. You'll be connecting your name to what in our eyes is a people who are not worthy of the name of God. Sure enough, Joe hears the price of doing the right thing. He hears the real price. This means marrying a Moabite, and he begins to backpedal. Joe says, whoa. The price of redemption is to marry a foreigner, a Moabite no less. And on top of that, I have to invest in caring for a child who counts as the heir of a dead man's household. And I have to raise what is genetically mine, but is what is legally an orphan until he's old enough to inherit his dead father's inheritance. In other words, Joe says, the cost of redemption is for me to take in a widow, for me to love a foreigner, and for me to care for and raise an orphan? This will ruin me in so many ways. To include having illegal half Moabite offspring. The price is too high. I can't do it. Joe is being asked to redeem the three marginalized classes of ancient people who God has said over and over again are at the center of his justice. Joe Schmo is being asked to care for a widow, a foreigner, and essentially an orphan. The widow, the foreigner, and the orphan. And Joe says to care for these people who are at the center of God's justice is too great a price. It risks ruining me. In the actions of the nameless Joe Schmo, we find the uncharitable, fearful, prejudiced theology that's being led by Ezra and Nehemiah. They're conducting the mission of expulsion of the Moabites and Hebrew children. It's interesting that our author leaves the actual name of the next of kin unspoken here. The slot for the name is open. There's no name. And perhaps this is done with the insinuation by our brilliant author that this slot is left open to insert the name of anyone who would act like Joe Schmo and Ezra and Nehemiah. In this case, the position of Joe, where his name goes, is left open so that if the uncharitable, fearful, prejudiced theological shoe fits me, I might say my name goes there. Perhaps the insinuation is that if you follow the theology of Ezra, Nehemiah, the countless others that are following them in their violent holy campaign, if you follow the example of Joe Schmo, the author says, I will not give you name recognition. No name goes there because you are not worthy of name recognition if you act like these people. This is much like the press today now refuses oftentimes to publish the names of mass shooters. Your actions do not warrant being credited with your name in print. For whatever reason, the author leaves the name open or refuses to taint a beautiful love story with the name of this relative, so-and-so. Joe tells Boaz, the price of redemption is too high. It can ruin me, and I cannot do it. I give you my right of redemption. You want to do this thing? You want to do this crazy thing? You go right ahead. And he takes off one of his shoes and he hands it to Boaz. We're going to stop here in Ruth chapter 4, verse 7. It says, now this is taking the shoe off and passing it over to the other guy. This was the custom of former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. The one took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. This is one of the ways that we know that the story is authored in a later date, even though it's set in the earlier days of the Judges. Not only is language and some other details in the story tied to a later date, but the author has to take time to explain this custom because it wasn't done anymore. There was a ritual of exchanging a sweaty shoe. How grateful are we that this ritual died out back then and isn't even today? Can you picture this ritual being done today? Oh, all right, great. I'm so glad we made a deal on this car. We closed the deal. Great. I'm going to go ahead here. Take my shoe and we'll close the deal on the car. And here you go. Here's my shoe. Sorry, it's been hot today. Thankfully, we don't do that anymore. And neither did the audience for the story of Ruth. So the author has to speak of former customs in former times because the story is being composed at a different date. And this custom has by then, thankfully, died out. So Joe hands his sandal, along with his permission, to Boaz. And with that permission, Boaz proudly proclaims to the witnesses who he called around him and all the rest who would have stopped to listen to the business of the day. He proclaims, "You are my witnesses, that I am redeeming Naomi's land and taking Ruth the Moabite as my wife." Notice the words of Boaz in Ruth 4:10. I have redeemed Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife. In the real world context of this story when it was written, as Ezra and Nehemiah are implementing the expulsion of the Moabites, also in context under the Torah, that you cannot be associated with God's people if you have a Moabite ancestor 10 generations ago, let alone being a pure-blooded Moabite. To be a Moabite is considered to be one of the worst of people. You are to be cut off from God, never to be found in his favor. We see this in the story of Ruth, as she is among God's people. But the Moabite is dismissed and placed in a negative light by all who are around, except for Boaz. She is uncared for by the people of Bethlehem when she arrives. Their only concern is Naomi. She is not given a personal identity by Boaz's manager, as he simply speaks of her as the Moabite. And she is cause for one person, Joe Schmo, to withhold his charity of redemption. But Boaz has never been hung up on what it seems everyone else is hung up on. Boaz does not see an obstacle in this unredeemable thing that everyone else sees in Ruth. Everyone else looks at Ruth and says she's unredeemable, never to be in God's people. Boaz says, I don't see what you're seeing. So Boaz declares of Ruth in Ruth 4:10. To read between the lines, if we can put Ruth 4:10 up there, thank you. Boaz declares of Ruth, I'm not ignorant of what other people see about you. I'm not glossing over what other people will hold against you. There is nothing about you that will surprise me later. I know the worst thing that people have to point out about you. And I choose still to marry and redeem you. Ruth, the Moabite. Boaz's statement, it lets everyone know that his eyes are open to all the facts of Ruth and who she is. And nothing about Ruth is a problem in light of Boaz's generous theology. Likewise, God came in the flesh of Jesus, to redeem us. And Jesus, time and again, demonstrates the same thing Boaz is showing here. My eyes are open to all the facts about you. I know what it is that is the worst in you that people will point to you and say, look at how bad that person is. Look at the Moabite. God in the flesh of Jesus shows that he knows the worst that people can and will say about each of us. He knows that we will deny him 3 times in a night. He knows that we will betray him with a kiss. He knows that we will even kill him. He knows all that. And he says, I know it all. Nothing you do will take me by surprise. My eyes are wide open about who you are. And nothing about who you are is an obstacle to my generous love. I will set the table for you, and I will dine with you. You are welcome at my table that I set, whether you are Ruth the Moabite or Judas the betrayer. And you can dine with me. And even as you kill me, I will express forgiveness. So we're going to close halfway through chapter 4 today. We'll stop there. Boaz is marrying Ruth. And his example of generous love, it brings the Jewish leaders and elders and the people who have gathered around to hear the business of the day. His generous love, his declaration for Ruth, the Moabite, it brings those around him to accept Ruth into the household of God, to cheer for her, and to say, Ruth, we're going to place you with our other matriarchs. May your name be like our other matriarchs. It is. And the contrast is clear between the zealous exclusion of the Jewish leaders, Ezra and Nehemiah, along with those who are following them, and the inclusive leadership of Boaz, who brings celebration and inclusion of all into God's agape love. Halfway through chapter 4, we now reach the culmination of the agape love of God that is expressed in the example of Boaz. It is a love that is charitable when we least feel worthy of it. It is a love that is fearless of the finger pointing. I know what they point to and call out in you, Ruth, the Moabite. I don't care. I know you feel like you're the foreign Moabite in my field, but I don't care. Come have lunch with me. It's a love that, unlike Joe Schmo, is unconcerned about the price of redemption. It is a love that sees us for who we are, with all our sins, all our faults. Everything the world says makes us unworthy. And yet, it is a love that chooses us again and again. And it is a love that leads to celebration when we come into the community. That people overlook the worst of us, that we're a Moabite, that whatever it is that could be called out about us, it overlooks the worst and it leads people to celebrate and say, welcome. May you stand with the greatest of us. That's the love of God expressed in the flesh of Jesus. And that's the love that Boaz exemplifies here.